ගමට සතුට ගෙන එන ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජනපෞර
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. My guest this evening is an associate member, recently appointed, an associate member of the working committee of the SJB, Kusum Wijetilleke. Very good evening, Kusum. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Faraz. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
Thank you. So Sri Lanka is in search of that elusive matter, a dollar earning strategy. Kusum, from where you are, what would be 5 steps to resolve the current situation that Sri Lanka is in, to reset, to get back?
Well, Faraz, it's a challenging question. I think before we come to 5 steps, let's take a look at some of the basics. Okay. Now, let's say you want to invest in Sri Lanka, so foreign direct investment. Let's talk about FDI. What is the position of the legal system in Sri Lanka? Now, if you and I have a contract dispute, if you go to court for a simple, basic breach of contract, in Sri Lanka, the average time it takes to execute a contract through the courts is about 300 days. In Singapore, it's just over 100 days. So that's the kind of thing that we have to change, because nobody's going to come and invest money if the judiciary and the legal system isn't up to par.
Right.
On the other side, we have to look at the labor force. And is our labor force equipped for the modern economy, for the global economy? Do we have the kinds of investment protections that other countries have? Are we connected to the world's trade links? Are we part of the global supply chain? Okay, so there are a number of things that we have to look at, and I think it's important that you grounded this conversation in the dollar aspect, because a lot of the issues that we have in terms of Sri Lanka's economy come down to the structural weaknesses we have with our dollar earnings. We simply don't earn enough dollars. We simply don't export enough.
But which is what the question is, really.
Yes.
What must be the dollar earning strategy?
So for us, there are two. I want to just make sure we don't conflate two things. Now, it's important that Sri Lanka becomes a manufacturing hub. Okay, it's important that we produce things. But at the same time, we have to be careful that we don't become a glorified assembly plant of sorts. Okay, so you will have a lot of interest in these assembly plants. But the fact of the matter is, an assembly plant doesn't really add enough value to the country in which the manufacturing happens.
But then Sri Lanka has no, apart from its agro business,
exactly.
Sri Lanka has no
precisely so
hardware.
Sri Lanka's main problem is that we have depended for 3 or 4 decades basically on the most rudimentary commodity exports. Okay, you take tea for instance. One of the things we've heard about for multiple decades, you would have heard it for multiple decades, we have to add value to our tea exports. Okay, so how has that gone? It's not gone very well. In the meantime, you can see a country like, say, Vietnam. Now, Vietnam went from producing virtually no mobile phones to become one of the biggest producers of mobile phones in the world. Likewise,
are they assembly?
No, they actually manufacture components.
But we don't
have
the resources here, do we?
We have to develop the resources, Farah. So that's the point I'm trying to make. The point is not that what can we do to earn dollars. What can we first do to set the foundation for earning US dollars? Okay, so the one way that we are attempting to do it is through tourism. Now, with tourism, there's a very specific problem we have, because our main tourism originating markets have been in Europe traditionally, right? The European markets have now, they're struggling with their own issues. Also, there's other markets that have opened up closer to those destinations. We've seen a big drop in the number of tourists that come from Germany, the UK, France, etc. They've been replaced by tourists from China, India, Russia, Ukraine, etc. But if you take a look at the per capita GDPs of those countries versus our original tourism originating countries, you can immediately see a drop in the per capita GDP. So that means their spending power is less. So in that case, even our short-term goals in terms of dollar earnings through tourism, it's going to be a challenge. Okay. For one thing, the air ticket prices have increased, more than doubled from the European continent.
Yeah.
So obviously we're going to have less volumes. On the other side, we simply haven't developed an industrial base. In fact, there's some statistics that show that since the 90s, we've in fact deindustrialized. Let's take the garment industry, for instance. The garment industry has been a godsend for Sri Lanka's manufacturing industry. But the garment industry, while generating a huge amount of dollars for us, it also imports a number of things. It imports dyes, it imports accessories, it imports machinery. It sometimes has to import even expertise. So before we even get to the fact of value addition and R&D and design within Sri Lanka, we haven't even got the basic infrastructure to produce the accessories for our garment industry.
And it doesn't help that the government isn't allowing, for whatever reason, isn't allowing imports.
Yes, I mean...
So where is the raw materials going to come from?
It's the complication that we're faced with for us, because on one side, you want to restrict imports to basically, it's part of the inflation consideration. But on the other side, the export market needs to import. I mean, almost everything that goes into the manufacturing process, the inputs, they are imported. So it's a challenge that Sri Lanka finds itself in. We're sort of paying the price for not industrializing in the mid-90s and the early 2000s, because that was the time when the Asian region, the Southeast Asian region, was really coming up. Now we've missed one boat. So the era of, I'd say, of cheap labor and cheap costs, that's sort of gone away. So now, and we would find it difficult to compete in those high volume markets anyway. So we have to really go into higher value items. So we are talking about moving up the industrial technology ladder, where you can start. So there's a couple of businesses in Sri Lanka that already manufacture components for, let's say, Toyota or for the...
Yes, there are.
A few. So that's the sort of model that we have to grow. There's no point inviting investors over and having, a road show and all of that. If once they come here, they find that there's not enough infrastructure, the labor force is not equipped, we don't have the banking systems connected to the entire world. So we have to sort of, it's not about A, B, and C. It's about changing the entire sort of foundation of our economy. And it's a huge challenge. It's something that's not talked about enough, frankly.
Thank you very much for your questions. One of them is in relation to what you just said. The viewers asking, what are these special products that Sri Lanka is making, which they don't seem to know about? And so let's tell them, shall we? I know from memory that there's one company that makes the sensors for the airbags in our cars, and that's exported, and I think almost every Japanese car carries that now, and that comes from Sri Lanka. There's another company that makes some form of device to control emissions, and that's used in top brand cars from Germany.
Yes, so there's a number of technologies like that. Even in the garment sector, I think some of our the technology that's gone into producing the garments are very high tech.
Indeed.
So in that sector, we have made progress. But it's about, let's say, now I take Vietnam again. Vietnam sort of when the pandemic came on, Vietnam's industrial sector was very nimble. It was able to transform itself into home tablets, into routers, into cameras, etc.
But Sri Lankans are, we say we're resilient, but we're also quite innovative. The third company manufactures special gloves, and it's the only company approved by the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States, and you must use those gloves in the C check and the D check or whatever the major checks on these aircraft. And so these are sort of little known stories.
And there's also the famous Lodestar company that were making the heavy tires, and
exactly.
that was I think it was in the 80s where it started out. So Sri Lanka has the capacities to do these things. Okay, there's no question about it. It's just that we have, for some reason, been prioritizing a separate type of industry for whatever reason. Okay, and you can look at that in detail later on if you like. And the fact of the matter is that Do we have many people, members of parliament, industry leaders that are in the forefront of the policy framework that are involved in export-oriented industry, or do we have many more that are involved in the import-oriented industry? And that might give you some idea of why our policies are the way they are.
One of the big topics at the moment is, of course, this domestic debt restructuring. And I've got a card that's coming up on your screen now, which Harsha will play up. And here it is. Look, it tells you how much of bonds and bills are held in billions of dollars, in billions of rupees, sorry. And so, NSB, People's Bank, and the Bank of Ceylon have got all that 3, 5, 6, and nearly about 6.7, close to 7. If there is a haircut, or if there's some impact on this, what on earth will happen to these banks? Surely they'll have to close shop.
Yes, I just want to point out, I think it says 1,400 billion, so that's about 1.4 trillion for NSB and so on. Yeah. So it's in the trillions, essentially.
2.3 trillion, so about 7 trillion.
So there's about 3 types of restructuring. So one is the haircut. Okay, that's the infamous thing where if you're owed $100, you're not going to get $100.
You might get 60.
You may, if you're lucky. The other one is what's called reprofiling. I think it's something that the word is in the media now, but what it actually means is it's just a moratorium. It's a maturity extension. So you're due to get $100 next week. You're not getting it $100 next week.
You'll get it 10 weeks later.
You get it a few weeks later. If not, maybe next year. And the other one is the coupon adjustment. So if you are meant to get a certain percentage of interest, you'll get a lesser amount, or whatever the government decides is equal. The other thing is there's 2 instruments, right? General instruments. One is a treasury bond and treasury bill. Yeah. Now, the joint communication from a few weeks ago from the treasury and the central bank said that treasury bills will not be restructured. Okay, but again, the commentary on some of that is because people ask the question, right? Whatever you call it, we can use all these fancy words for treasury bonds, treasury bills, Sri Lanka development bonds, all that. All we're saying is that the government has borrowed money. It can be from you and me. It can be from...
So basically, just to just to get it right, a bill is up to 365 days.
Sure.
And anything beyond that becomes a bond.
Correct.
It's as simple as that.
Yes, and I think the term that's going on right now is domestic debt optimization. Okay, so optimization is another way of saying restructuring. Yes. So it's not a haircut. I don't think there's any conversation right now about a haircut.
It's about an extension.
It's about an extending the maturity. It's about providing some kind of moratorium. Okay, now the problem that the Treasury and the central bank have is that the central bank is also the lender of last resort to the government. Yeah. Okay, so if you can, on one side, restructure some of this debt, but it might be, I think, on your own channel on the Face the Nation program, Dr. Murtaza Jafferji was talking about how if you go to restructure treasury bills between the government and the CBSL, you're essentially taking money from one pocket and putting it into the other. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to your overall debt restructuring. So if anything, the financial institutions, they might suffer some aspect of it. And on that same program, there was a member of the banking industry, the banking fraternity. I think he was the DGM of Hatton National Bank, and he was mentioning, well, he was put in a tough position because on one side you have to sort of bring out confidence in the banking sector, okay, because the banking sector depends on the confidence that people have in that system. On the other side, you have to also stress that there is a huge amount of stress on the bank's balance sheets, okay, already, because he mentioned that in the next few quarters you will see some of these banks reporting their impairments. Impairments is another fancy word for bad loans. So you have all these industries that have been affected by the pandemic, by the economic collapse. They've been granted moratoriums for a number of years. Now those moratoriums are coming to an end, and these companies now have to start paying up, unless the central bank comes up with a new scheme and says, okay, grant another moratorium. So in that sense, the bank's balance sheets are already being stressed. So on top of that, if the IMF and the debt restructuring program says, okay, no, we need to do a debt optimization, that has to be done in very close conjunction with the financial sector. Now, one of the problems I saw a few weeks ago was the President's remarks in Parliament about you know, if the banks bring all these demands, maybe I'll ask the banks to come and run the economy. Now, those kinds of statements are very worrying because...
Is it also worrying that he said he might have to shut the stock exchange
it was
down?
part of the same remarks, right? Now, with the stock exchange, perhaps he's talking about the circuit breaker, where in some stock markets, if there's a big crash, you have a way of shutting it down.
Yeah.
But before you come down to shutting the stock market, there's a lot of other things that happen, and I think some of the banks will have repercussions long before you come to the stock market. So I think what the banking fraternity, I think the APB, the Association of Professional Bankers, put out a statement about 2 weeks ago as well, and they specifically used the term transparency in that statement. They said there isn't enough transparency in this process, and they appealed to the president for this. So maybe that was what the president was reacting to. But certainly, and remember, the president is not just the president; he's the finance minister. He's also the face of our negotiations with external creditors.
Indeed.
So for him to make a statement like that, I think it shows a certain high-handed nature of the process. It shows that and we've seen this even with the trade unions, for instance, right? The negotiations with the trade unions have happened, they've only announced them very recently. They should have been happening at the very first instance. You know, these are the stakeholders, these are the workers of Sri Lanka. You can have your critique about this SOEs, about the state wasting money, you can have all, but these are still working people. And you can't just leave them in the lurch. That negotiation should have been prioritized. Instead, what's happening is the government has made all these plans for external creditors and the IMF, and now they've come and told the people, they've told the political opposition, and they're telling the business sector, this is the deal. And I don't think that's a very good way to go about it.
No, but in the meantime, Kusum, we can't get rid of the fact that Sri Lanka needs a dollar earning strategy. I hear what you say about the FDIs and the legal issues and so on that surrounding all that, but all that seems to be taking time. If you had a look at the 48 economic indicators, which of these would you urge the government of the day to fully concentrate on so as to increase the earning capacity of dollars?
I would say for us, Sri Lanka's future, we can talk about the service sector. But if we don't focus on industrialization, that is real manufacturing of high technology products in Sri Lanka, we're not going to get anywhere. So I think the first thing is that you have to start laying the foundations and the conditions for investment in Sri Lanka, where a foreign company like Samsung went to Vietnam. You know, the red carpet was rolled out for them, and they said, "What do you need?" And that's the kind of thing that Sri Lanka has to do. Now, we've missed the boat on some of these sectors.
Sri Lanka, with all due respect, the people there might say, well, what's in it for me? Well, what will you give me? And then I'll facilitate everything else. And that's... Let's discuss this a bit more in detail. Let's go for a quick break, take a peek at this evening's headlines, which is now ready, and we'll see you on the other side of the break with Kusum Wijetilleke.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1. TV1, TV for life.
Central Bank bill to be debated in Parliament on Thursday. Bill is flawed. Present a fresh draft. Gammampila requests. Opposition alliances in talks over way forward. Incumbent president was appointed only to complete Gotabaya Rajapaksa's term. No further agreements made, says SLPP General Secretary.
අන්නේ වැඩපිළිවෙලින් වත්මන් ජනාධිපතිතුමා ඇතුළු රජය වෙනත් පැත්තකට යනවා නම් අපිට ඒ සම්බන්ධයෙන් සාකච්ඡා කරන්න සිදු වේවි.
Price of imported wheat flour hiked by 10 rupees. Investigation officers of the Consumer Affairs Authority on a token strike. Ancient Wadua Ketu Gala in Dambadeniya to be converted into a stone quarry.
TV1, TV for life. News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And welcome back. I'm in conversation with Kusum Wijetilleke, Associate Member of the Working Committee of the SJB. Congratulations, by the way, on that new...
Oh, thank you very much for us. Thank you for that.
I hope you help Mr. Premadasa and company.
Yes, of course. I want to thank the opposition leader, the members of the Working Committee, the senior members, the parliamentary group for the invitation and the nomination and the inclusion.
You'll now become a much sought after commodity probably from the Rajapaksas. They might try to get you to cross over.
I think the crossover is an interesting culture that we have in Sri Lanka. It's something that needs to change, I think.
Indeed. So let's get back to this economic indicators. Of the 48, where would you say the government of the day needs to focus on?
Well, if you look at the period of industrialization in the 90s, okay, the Rana Singha Premadasa period, it was very much a point of there was a global quota of garments that some of the other economies in our country. So this is why I say we missed the boat, right? So in the 90s, some of the larger economies in Southeast Asia were basically saying that we no longer want to do these manufacture these products because we are moving on to higher tech manufacturing, and these are lower margin products. So we need to give them out to other places. That's part of the reason why our manufacturing of garment sector took off. So it's all up to the government policymakers to look at what are the growth sectors in the world in terms of technology. So, like I said, Vietnam took advantage of the need for personal computing and the need for personal communication devices, webcams, microphones, that kind of thing. So going forward, there's no rule book or playbook for this. You can't borrow a textbook from the library and say, how do we industrialize? You have to go on what is happening in the market at the moment, where can Sri Lanka fit in? And I think the best way to do that is to just invite as many foreign companies as you can and provide them with the framework in Sri Lanka to have at least a small, even 0.5% of their manufacturing operation globally, have it based in Sri Lanka. Now, there's the thing about the global trade system for us, if I can just divert for a second. The main issue with the global trade regime is that it's a race to the bottom. Okay, so multinational companies go where the costs are cheap. Costs are labor, costs are energy, and costs are capital, infrastructure, that kind of thing. So in Sri Lanka, let's say the issue is labor laws. You know, there was some conversation about, I don't personally think that labor laws are such a big issue for Sri Lanka's industrialization, but let's take that as a starting point. Maybe the government has to relax labor laws in a specific free trade zone. But on the other side, the government has to then subsidize the lives of those people, because if they're not earning enough money, even through a multinational, to make a decent living in Sri Lanka, the government surely has to subsidize that as well. So there shouldn't be a give and take here, because at the end of the day, what's the point in working? What's the point in working 12 hours a day if you can't put a roof over your head? Okay, that's the main problem with economics, right? Economics will tell you about all these fancy things, but at the end of the day, the problem that we have across the world is that there are people working full-time jobs but can't afford to live without taking a loan. They can't afford a bill, an unexpected hospital bill. They have to take a loan, or they pump up their credit cards. Okay, and a credit card has 3-4% interest monthly. So, but at the same point, multinationals aren't going to come here if they think our labor is too costly. So on one side, you have to incentivize people to come here. But on the other side, the government can't say, well, now you've got a job, make what you do. That's not going to improve our country's standards of living, and that's not going to take us up because there's no point in there being a state if you're not going to lay the conditions for people to move up the socio-economic ladder. You and I, we go to work, or we do some job because we have some dream someday, right? We want to build a house, we want to buy a car, we want to get married, we want to do something, we want to do something with our lives. It's not about saying, oh yeah, we can earn enough money just to get by from one month to the other. I don't think that is going to, overall, it's not going to take our country anywhere.
I hear what you're saying, and I'd like to also point out that there'll be scores of youth out there who've just heard you and who must be wondering how sons of politicians are able to afford all the things that Kusum just said without having a job. Something to think about. I think it is something to think about because I know people who work here. They the younger ones will be thinking of getting a lease and buying a bike or a car or whatever it is. But they're able to do that because they've got a job and they do an honest day's work and they get paid for that. And when you then compare the children of various politicians who don't appear to do anything but have lots of money to have fabulous weddings and state-of-the-art cars and so on and so forth. And this is, these are not prescribed in the constitution of this country. Constitution of this country appears to say, or does say, that we are all equal. The people are all equal, one and all, including the president. So basically what you say is that we need to focus on attracting the big names.
Big names with a view to industrialize. I think so, for us. I think so. I think that the world is growing and there's new technology coming up. You know, there's robotics happening. There's a lot of ways Sri Lanka can get involved. And the good thing is that there's Sri Lankans around the world that are willing to, I think, accommodate, come back. If you give them some reason to come back and say that you can actually contribute to our economy. Sri Lankans like nothing more than spending time in Sri Lanka. You know this well, right?
Yes.
So give them any excuse to come back, and I think they will. But it all depends on the state. I just want to point out something else. I saw an article in the paper recently in the Financial Times talking about how Sri Lanka has doubled our government revenue in the first quarter of 2023. That's good news because that's part of the thing that the IMF and the multilaterals have been telling us is to increase our revenue.
Yeah.
So while we've increased revenue to 116% compared to last year, it sounds great. But the fact of the matter is that comes to about 300 billion rupees for the first quarter. But the target for the first quarter, as per the recent government's budget, was something like 550 billion. So we're already about 200 billion short on that. Okay, so if we're not going to reach the revenue targets, what's next? Then we have to reduce further our costs if we're going to reach this primary account surplus. So I don't see enough focus on the government's cost base. And whatever cost base is reduced, it seems to be being reduced from the social protections that are going to
It seems to me, Kusum, that much of what you're saying and what needs to be done in Sri Lanka is sort of intertwined with politics. Yes. And I quote from somebody who sent me a long message. It says here, most of the so-called diaspora also have adopted a wait-and-see attitude until they see a clear political will for devolution. That's going to be a hell of a long wait.
I mean, it's also a matter of trust for us. I think if anyone was paying attention in 2015, 2016, there were multiple reports from every multilateral institution. They all said the same thing. They all said revenue-based fiscal consolidation. So I read the reports from the IMF in 2000 because we entered an IMF agreement in 2016 under the Hapanya government. So every year they have a review statement. Every year that review statement says the same thing. We aren't generating enough government revenue. So how come in 2019 the government, with all their advisors and with all the strategies and that large manifesto, the Vistas of Prosperity, how did we come to a point where the government thought tax cuts were the way to go? You know, when every multilateral institution's report has consistently said revenue-based fiscal consolidation. How did the political class come to view revenue-based fiscal consolidation as a tax cut? So it's completely, it's on two sides of the spectrum. So I think anyone that looks at this from the outside will think there's a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing. I mean, it's sort of going against everything that all the data suggested. And I don't think there's any excuse for refuting such an overwhelming amount of data.
So really there is no easy route.
No, I think for there to be an easy route, you have to have buy-in. That's what the IMF representative Peter Brewer said. He said that very early on when he came to Sri Lanka. He said there has to be public buy-in. And the fact is that this government doesn't seem to be interested in public buy-in. Okay, they're only interested in suppressing protests and controlling the media cycle. There doesn't seem to be. So do you
believe that the president has done a pretty good job so far?
No, I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think
what is he doing then?
If you look at the tax structure, if you look at the lack of cash transfers, if you look at the breakdown in social protections, I mean, we've seen child malnutrition double. We've seen poverty rate double. I don't see how anyone can justify saying it's a good job he's doing. I'm sorry.
Much to be desired.
Much more, yeah.
Kusum Wijetilleke, thank you very much for being on
Thank you,
Newsline
Faraz.
Live.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. And that's the way it was on Newsline Live with Kusum Wijetilleke, Associate Member of the Working Committee of the SJB. And it's now time for the Primetime News. Take care, have a great evening as much as you can, and of course, God bless you all.